Picture this. It's a rainy night in early spring. The forest is dark, but if you look closely, you'll see something extraordinary. Scores of creatures, salamanders, frogs, and toads, are emerging from the soil, crawling, hopping their way to vernal pools located throughout the forest. This is the big night, one of nature's most magical events. I've been lucky enough to witness this event firsthand, even with our daughter. We'll put on our headlamps, grab our rain gear, and head out to the forest to see such an incredible, albeit short distance migration. It's like stepping into a hidden world that people often don't get to see. So, planning has already started for this year's local event. It should happen in the next few weeks. Excuse me, big nights don't happen just in the forest, though. When they occur, it's about having the right conditions for these species to emerge and make their way to the vernal pools where they, as one modern poet said it, like to get their friction on. But big night efforts are often about supporting them in road crossings because that can be really dangerous. So there's local conservation groups all across the country that when conditions are right, they get those mass emails out and they deploy groups to known streets that have crossings near vernal pools, but also have a lot of traffic in those hours from when it gets dark until the traffic dies down. And so it's important to get out there and help those amphibians cross the road whenever you can. Help ensure cars are aware of what's going on so that they slow down and go like 5 miles an hour per less until they're out of the danger zone. And for the ones that don't make it, it's important to count and remove any dead amphibians from the road so that we can keep track of the data and know what the population volumes look like year to year and if those efforts are being successful.
I love how kind humans can be in areas like this. I really find it heartwarming. And I know that Dustin and our daughter have loved this event and going out in early spring for a long time to check out the vernal pools and see all of the action. But for today's discussion, I want to pause for a moment because I think we should start with the basics. So, Dustin, not everybody may know or understand what a vernal pool is and why they're so important. So could you start by kind of walking us through some of that?
Sure. Vernal pools are small, temporary, seasonal ponds. Think of it as more like a deep puddle that forms in the spring from snow melt and the spring rains. But they usually dry up by late summer. And because they dry up for part or most of the year even, they can't support fish. And that's really important because if there were fish in the pools, they would eat all the eggs and it wouldn't create a good habitat for them. So this makes them perfect for amphibians and important to protect as well. They're like nurseries for these amphibians. So they lay their eggs there, and then those larvae develop in the safety of those fish-free waters. Because they're temporary, they're also vulnerable. If these pools are destroyed or disrupted, it can have a huge impact on the local amphibian populations. So it's important to know that the vernal pools are there, document them. You can, most states even have a certification program where you can take photos of the pool, the location, the egg masses that are present, or the frogs and other things themselves, like fairy shrimp, things like that. But it can have a real positive impact if you know what's there and take the time to document it.
One of the things that I was thinking about when we were preparing for shooting this video was thinking about vernal pools. Are they always located in the same spot in the forest, or do they move around?
They're pretty much always in the same spot. There's some places that might be a vernal pool one year and not another. Like we just had a strong drought year, although now there's a lot of snow melt happening here, so everything's pretty wet. But they pretty much are always in the same spot because they form in the depressions in the lowlands where things might, just the way you see, a puddle at the bottom of your driveway in the same spot all the time. It's kind of like that. They also rely on very specific conditions. So you need to have the right soil type, topography, and water sources so they don't just pop up randomly. They don't move around. And size and depth are really important as well. Those can vary a little bit year to year depending on rainfall and snowmelt. But some are so consistent that they've been used for amphibians for hundreds of years, right? Many, many generations. And that's why protecting these areas is so important. They're like ancient meeting grounds for these species.
So I think these are fascinating little locations in the forest. I also am a fan of nature trivia. And so I had asked you to do a little digging into what are some really unique or surprising facts about vernal pools that most people might not know. What did you find?
Well, For one, these are like genetic time capsules practically. Some of these species have relied on them for millions of years, like the fairy shrimp that I mentioned, and they're specially adapted to these temporary habitats. Vernal pools also can actually communicate with the species, so they generate particular characteristics like pH levels and other natural chemicals that might be in the soil. And some species, like wood frogs, have even learned to detect those species and use that as a signal to trigger that it's a safe place to reproduce. And that's what draws them there. They also, many of them have a really high site fidelity where they knew they were born in a place and they went off during their life, but they returned to that place to find others to mate with. They know that if it worked for them, hopefully it'll work for the next generation too. So these are like biodiversity hotspots. Even though they're small and temporary, they support a huge variety of life, from insects and crustaceans to amphibians and birds. They also are food sources for a lot of animals. So the loss of vernal pools can lead to the decline of not just amphibians, but also the species that depend on them, like birds and small animals. So it's really important to be informed about where development is allowed to continue responsibly.
I want to talk about all the little amphibians that rely on these vernal pools. I know there's some really unique species out there, and I want to start with my personal favorite, which many of our viewers are probably going to know of as well, and that's the spring peepers. So they are so loud for being such little frogs. And aside from those wonderful little singing voices of theirs, what else makes them so special?
Well, spring peepers are tiny little frogs, but their calls are anything but small. They're one of the first signs of spring, and their high-pitched peeps can carry on for miles. So I know we love to keep the windows cracked when you hear the spring peepers, because you hear them going, it doesn't go all night. They tend to go for a few hours and then quiet down. But usually when you're going to sleep, they're still carrying on. So they're really fun. So they're one of those first signs of spring. They're found all over the eastern U.S. and Canada, from the Gulf Coast all the way up to the Midwest and the Northeast. We're recording this in early March. I'm sure some places in the mid-Atlantic and southward are already hearing spring peepers. We should be hearing them in the next couple of weeks here. And they're really adaptable species that can live in a variety of habitats, from forest to wetlands. A lot of modern development practices have rainwater runoff and catch basins, and those, especially if they have small trees and stuff around them, can be natural breeding grounds for spring peepers. So a lot of modern neighborhoods have them as well. And as a fun fact, they have a special superpower where they actually create some of these frog species can create kind of a glucose-based substance in their bodies that allows them to freeze solid during the winter. So as soon as that temperature gets up above freezing and you get maybe a nice warm rain where they can continue to stay moist, then they'll come out and start their call.
That's so cool. I love them. I think the only amphibian that I love more, or at least as much as spring peepers, is, so we have a bullfrog that usually lives on the shore of the lake right near our house. And in the summer months, you can hear him singing his love songs into the night, just looking for his lady.
Just one, huh?
To me, it's just one. To me, when I hear the spring peepers, that really signals to me that spring has gotten here. And the next amphibian that I thought we would talk about is our daughter's favorite. And that's the spotted salamander. She has loved these things since she was an itty bitty little girl. Isn't that right? So they're part of big night migration too, correct?
They are, and they're one of the stars of the big night in our area. They have these striking yellow spots. They can grow up to 9 inches long, so they're practically, a mature spotted salamander is practically the size of your hand, from the heel of your hand all the way to your fingertip. They also spend most of their lives underground, so you don't see them often, but on these first rainy spring nights, they emerge and make their way to the vernal pools, and they lay their eggs right in the water, and the larvae develop there in the water. And they're fascinating because they have a symbiotic relationship with algae. The algae actually lives inside of the egg masses and creates oxygen for the eggs to utilize in the development process.
That's really, really cool. So they have like these little oxygen factories in their eggs. Huh. As you're talking and we're talking about amphibians, and I'm thinking more and more about frogs, I'm remembering, and I wonder if you remember it, a specific hike that we took when our daughter was little. And as we were walking through the forest, we heard this quacking sound. and she came across this little guy, this little frog. That's what she used to call all the little animals.
It's just a little guy.
Look at this little guy. Do you remember that?
I do. I don't remember where we were specifically, but it was somewhere here in town on one of our conservation lands for sure. And it was a wood frog. So, we talked about the spring peepers, but we also have gray tree frogs and wood frogs. And each of them sort of come out on their own schedule. Like often on a big night, you'll have some of all of them, but they all do have their own timing. So you might have one week that it's all spring peepers, and the following week it's all gray tree frogs, and the next week it's all wood frogs, and I might have the sequence out of order. I feel like I have to relearn that every year. But they do have the wood frogs do have a really distinctive quack-like call, and they're one of the first ones, the early ones that emerge in the spring, often while there's still snow on the ground. So they're incredibly hardy. They can survive being frozen solid during the winter with that antifreeze process I mentioned. And these are found across the U.S. and Canada also, and they rely on those vernal pools for breeding.
Okay. All right. So I'm looking at our notes, and the next one on the list is one that I know you've mentioned to me before, but I think you said it was pretty elusive. I don't recall ever seeing one of these, and that's the eastern spadefoot. What's that amphibian about?
Yeah, this is also on my bucket list. I've not seen one either, but the eastern spadefoot is fascinating because it lives most of its life buried underground, and it's called a spadefoot because they actually have kind of a special toe that looks like a shovel that they use to dig a hole in the ground. And they are threatened here in Massachusetts because their habitats are being lost to development and climate change. And because they spend all of their time underground, they're often not detected, and therefore we don't always realize when development is disrupting their habitat. And they've got that unique foot that helps them dig into the soil. That's how they get their name.
That's sad to hear that they're threatened. I'm glad that we have so much conservation land in our town, because that always reminds me that all these little critters that are living on the conservation land are protected, right? So the next salamander on our big night list is the marbled salamander. So I don't think I've seen one of these either. But you had mentioned when we were going through these notes before we started recording that this one in particular has a unique breeding cycle, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit backwards from all the rest. These ladies lay their eggs in the fall, which is the opposite cycle from the rest. And then the eggs overwinter and then hatch in the spring instead of having the big night process. So we don't tend to see them on the big night the way that we do with all the other species, even though their eggs and their egg masses will be in the same vernal pools. They also are state listed as threatened in Massachusetts, so they're another one we need to keep our eye on. And they have these beautiful black and white marbled pattern, which makes them really striking to look at. So this is another one that's on my bucket list.
Now we have our list of animals to look for on big night, as well as one special salamander that you won't see going to a vernal pool on big night, though their eggs are likely in there. Next, I want to touch on something that you mentioned about a few of them, which is their conservation status, and unfortunately, some of them being on that threatened list. So what are the big challenges these amphibians are facing? And are you aware of any conservation efforts that are currently in play for these little animals of the vernal pools?
Yeah, their biggest threat is habitat loss. So whether we're putting in a road or a housing development, or even clear cutting a forest to turn it into agricultural land, that all of those activities would degrade the ability for the vernal pool to continue existing. So that's really important. And in Massachusetts and many other towns, but I'm more familiar with, states, but I'm more familiar with Massachusetts, this is what your local conservation commission is in control of, being aware and managing the permitting process for development. So oftentimes there's a buffer zone around any wetlands or around any vernal pools. So if there is a housing or a development permit that's being pursued, the Conservation Commission or the local authority for that can help the developer plan accordingly and either not permit in a given location or make sure that it's done responsibly to keep the vernal pools in operation. Climate change is also a big concern because it can alter the timing of breeding cycles and dry up vernal pools too quickly. So some of the vernal pools simply might not exist if the climate changes too much, or certain climate changes might make new vernal pools happen in places where they were not before, particularly if the rain cycles or the snowmelt cycles are really different. But we've had a couple of winters in a row now without very much snow, so there's not as much water runoff that then fuels the vernal pools. But luckily, vernal pools, they are pretty resilient and they're made to fluctuate, right? Every year is not the same as every other year. So as long as we're intentional about it, I think that's the main thing. There's also great conservation efforts underway, like protecting vernal pools through legislation, creating wildlife corridors to connect habitats, and citizen science projects like one called FrogWatch USA can also play a huge role.
FrogWatch, that sounds fun. How does that work?
Well, if you're looking for a unique hobby, I guess this is a good one. Volunteers get trained in person or online sessions to identify frogs and toad species by their calls. Then they go out to the local wetlands and vernal pool areas and other water bodies, typically during the breeding season, like February to August, and record the species that they hear. You can submit those observations to a national database, which is used by researchers and conservationists to track amphibian populations over time. And then that data helps to identify species and their movements so you can tell if they're growing or declining or facing threats. Volunteers can receive access to field guides, call recordings, and other resources to help them succeed. And a program like that fosters a sense of community among volunteers who often get a nice rewarding feeling from being able to contribute, work as a team, participate in local chapters, and it raises awareness about the importance of amphibians and their role in the ecosystem.
Okay. So I think this was a really fun topic. I really enjoyed this one. And so what I would ask of our viewers, let us know in the comments, do you listen for the spring peepers? And have you ever participated in a big night event? Do you think you might in the future, now that you've heard about them, if you weren't aware of them before?
And don't forget to subscribe to Hike and Hearth TV. As spring approaches and we start getting out on more adventures like a big night anytime soon, we'll be posting a lot of content showing what we find.
So that's all for today's episode. But before we head off on our next adventures, this is just a quick reminder to you, our viewer, that you can find Dustin's wildlife photography and links to all of our content channels on our website, hikeandhearth.com.
And we love being part of the YouTube nature lovers community. So keep sharing your comments on your experiences with nature, wildlife, and conservation. And if you're not already a subscriber, please be sure to join us.
Okay, Dustin, are you ready to send us off for today?
I sure am. Until next time, friends, keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild.